The fever broke on a Tuesday, but Maria Bell did not know that until much later. What she knew in that moment, the moment that would rewrite every assumption she had ever made about her own solitude, about the hardness of men, about the impossibility of being saved, was the feeling of arms. Arms that did not waver. Arms that had carried her through darkness and cold and blistering noon heat for 3 days without once setting her down on the earth and walking away. She remembered opening her eyes to a sky so blue it hurt, and then she remembered a jaw, square and rough and unshaven, angled above her like something carved from the same granite as the mountains themselves. She remembered a voice, low and deliberate, saying her name the way a person says the name of something they are terrified to lose. Maria, stay with me, Maria. She had not stayed, not entirely. She had drifted back into the burning dark, and when she surfaced again she was inside somewhere, a doctor's office. She would later understand, in the town of Abilene, Kansas, which was 2 counties and a river crossing beyond the place where Jasper Trask had found her collapsed in the dirt outside the ruins of what had once been her homestead. That was the truth that undid her, not the fever. Not the 3 days she had spent burning from the inside out with a bacterial infection that the doctor in Abilene called a serious case of blood poisoning, the kind that killed women on the frontier with grim regularity. Not even the fact that she had been alone when it struck, her nearest neighbor 12 miles distant, her husband 16 months in the ground. What undid her was the detail she learned later in pieces, from the doctor himself, and from the 2 stable hands at the livery on the edge of town who had watched the mountain man carry the woman inside. Jasper Trask had walked. He had walked the full distance, 41 miles across 3 counties, through the Flint Hills and across the Smoky Hill River and into Abilene, because his horse had thrown a shoe on the second ridge, and he had refused to wait for morning. He had carried Maria Bell in his arms for 41 miles because she was burning with fever and drifting in and out of consciousness, and he was not willing to let the frontier take another person from him. She did not know yet what that meant. She did not know yet about the dark past that drove a man to walk 41 miles with a woman he had barely spoken 3 sentences to before she collapsed. She did not know about the secrets he carried with the same silent endurance with which he carried her. She only knew that when she finally opened her eyes in full consciousness, 3 days after arriving in Abilene, he was still there, sitting in the wooden chair beside her cot, hat on his knee, eyes on the door as though something might come through it that needed stopping. That was the beginning. That was where the story really started. But to understand why it mattered, you had to go back to the place where it had all been set in motion, back to the Smoky Hills of Kansas in the autumn of 1873, to the particular loneliness that had been living in Maria Bell like a second heartbeat for the better part of 2 years. Maria Bell had come to Kansas from Virginia in 1870. She had come as a bride. Her husband, Thomas Bell, had been a good man in the way that many men of that era were good, steady, hardworking, not given to cruelty or drink. He had filed on a quarter section of land under the Homestead Act, and he had built her a house with his own hands, and he had planted winter wheat, and he had died of a ruptured appendix in March of 1872 without ever seeing the first profitable harvest. He was 28 years old. Maria was 24. She had stayed. That was the decision that defined her in the eyes of every neighbor and shopkeeper and circuit preacher who passed through that section of Kansas. Most women would have gone back east. Most women would have taken the first stage to a rail connection and put the frontier behind them like a bad dream. Maria Bell had stayed because the land was hers now, because she had helped break it and plant it, and she was not willing to hand it to someone else, and because, though she would not have said this out loud, going back to Virginia would have meant accepting that the future she had traveled so far to build had simply ceased to exist. She was not a woman who accepted things easily. She was tall for the era, 5 feet 6 inches, which made her eye level with many of the men in the region. She had dark hair she wore pinned back during the day and loose at night. Her eyes were the particular amber brown of creek water in autumn, and they had a quality of directness that made some people uncomfortable and made others, the braver ones, feel seen in a way they could not explain. Her hands were calloused from work. Her voice was low and certain. She had taught herself to shoe a horse by watching a farrier twice and then practicing until she could do it in the dark. She had been alone on her homestead for 16 months when Jasper Trask appeared. He had not appeared so much as materialized. That was how it felt. One morning in late September of 1873, there was simply a man living in the old Harker cabin on the eastern edge of the ridge, a cabin that had been empty since old Pete Harker had drunk himself into his grave the previous winter. No one had seen Jasper Trask arrive. No one had introduced him. He was simply there. The way weather was simply there, without announcement or apology. Maria had first heard his name from the postmaster in the nearest town, a settlement called Dry Creek that was barely large enough to deserve the name. The postmaster, a garrulous man named Elwood Pitts, had told her that the new man on the Harker place was called Jasper Trask, that he had come down from Colorado, and that he was, by all observable evidence, a man who preferred his own company to anyone else's. Tall fellow, Elwood had said. Quiet, bought 3 months of supplies at once, does not appear to be the neighboring type. Maria had filed this information away without particular interest. She had enough to concern herself with. The wheat needed to be got in before the first hard frost. The roof of the henhouse was failing. There was a section of fence on the northern boundary that the previous summer's drought had worked loose from its posts, and if she did not fix it before the cattle from the Morrison Ranch to the west found the gap, she would spend a miserable week rounding up other people's livestock. She did not think about Jasper Trask again for 3 weeks, and then one morning she came out to find that the section of fence on her northern boundary had been repaired. Not just fixed, properly fixed, with new posts set deep in the ground and new wire stretched taut and stapled with the kind of precision that suggested someone who had done this work before and understood exactly why it mattered. She stood at the repaired section for a long moment in the cold October morning, her breath making small clouds in the air, and she felt something she had not felt in a very long time. She felt noticed. She looked east toward the Harker cabin, which was barely visible as a dark shape against the ridge in the distance. Then she looked at the fence posts again. Then she turned and went back to work, because there was always more work. She did not go to thank him. She told herself this was because she was not certain it was him, and that was partly true. But the other part was something she was not ready to name, a caution that ran deeper than manners, rooted in the part of her that had built walls around itself after Thomas died, walls she had mortared carefully and inspected regularly, and was not prepared to see disturbed by a quiet man from Colorado who fixed fences in the dark. The disturbing happened anyway. It happened in increments, which was the most unsettling possible way for it to happen. A week after the fence, she found a bundle of split firewood stacked on her porch. Not all the wood she would need for winter, just enough to make a difference in the immediate term, split clean and stacked with the bark side out the way an experienced woodsman would know to do it. No note, no explanation, just the wood. She stacked more on top of it and said nothing. 2 weeks after that, she encountered Jasper Trask in person for the first time. She had ridden into Dry Creek for supplies and come out of the general store to find a tall man leaning against the hitching post beside her horse, not aggressively, but with the particular ease of someone who had nowhere urgent to be. He was examining the horse's near foreleg with a focused expression, and when she came out he straightened and took off his hat. "Back left shoe is working loose," he said. "She'll throw it before you're halfway home if you don't get it looked at." Maria stopped on the porch steps and looked at him for a moment. He was, as Elwood Pitts had said, tall. He was also younger than she had imagined. She guessed late 20s, perhaps 30, with the weathered look of someone who spent most of his time outdoors. He had dark hair that wanted cutting and gray eyes that were doing the same direct thing her own eyes apparently did to people looking at her with the full attention of someone genuinely interested in what they found. He was not handsome in the conventional way of the dime novels that occasionally circulated through Dry Creek. He was something more interesting than handsome. He had the kind of face that asked questions of you. "You're the man on the Harker place," she said. "Jasper Trask," he said. "You're Maria Bell." "I am," she said, "and I know about the shoe. I noticed it this morning. I was going to ask the livery man to look at it before I headed back." A brief pause. "All right," he said, and put his hat back on, and that was apparently the end of it because he pushed off the hitching post and walked across the street toward the dry goods store without looking back. Maria watched him go. She thought about the fence. She thought about the firewood. She thought about the way he had said her name, not as a question, not as the opening line of an unwanted conversation, just as a fact he was confirming for himself. She took her horse to the livery and had the shoe reset and rode home thinking about things she had promised herself she would not think about. This was the beginning of a back and forth that took several weeks to develop any real shape. They saw each other in town twice more in October, and each time the conversation was brief and practical, and carried beneath its surface some quality Maria could not quite identify, not tension exactly, but awareness, the mutual recognition of two people who are each trying to figure out what the other one is. In November, the weather turned early and hard. A blizzard came roaring down from the north on the 3rd of the month and dropped 18 inches of snow in 2 days, and Maria lost 4 chickens to the cold and nearly lost a fifth of her stored wheat to a leak she had not caught in time. She spent 3 days digging out, her back aching, her hands so cold inside her gloves she could not feel the shovel handle, and she was standing outside her barn on the 3rd morning surveying the damage when she heard the creak of snow under boots and turned around. Jasper Trask was walking toward her through the white field with 2 sacks over his shoulders. He did not call out or wave. He walked up to her and set the sacks down and said, "Brought cornmeal and salt pork." "Figured the snow might have gotten into your stores." She stared at him. "How did you know about the wheat?" "I didn't," he said. "I guessed. The leak is on the north side of the roof where the ice builds up." "Same problem on the Harker cabin. I noticed when I was fixing it." There was a long silence in which the cold air moved between them, and Maria Bell made a decision she had not consciously intended to make. She said, "Come inside. I'll make coffee." He came inside. They sat at her table and drank coffee and said very little, but the things they said mattered. He told her, without preamble or drama, that he had come from Colorado, that he had worked as a guide and a trapper in the Rockies for 6 years, and that he had come to Kansas because he needed level ground for a while. She did not ask him what he meant by that. She filed it alongside the other things she knew about him, the fence, the firewood, the way he had identified her horse's loose shoe from 10 feet away, and let it sit. She told him that the farm had been her husband's and was now hers, and that she intended to keep it, whatever anyone else thought about whether that was practical. He said, "I don't see why it wouldn't be practical." She looked at him across the table. "Most people think a woman alone on a quarter section is either brave or foolish." "Most people," he said, "have never watched you work." The color that came into her face at that surprised her. She had not blushed in a very long time, and she did not care for the vulnerability of it, so she stood up and refilled the coffee and moved the conversation to practical matters. The storm damage, the state of the trail between her homestead and Dry Creek, whether the creek ford would be passable before the temperature came back up. He answered her questions, and eventually stood and put on his hat and coat and said, "I'll come by tomorrow to check the roof." She did not tell him that was unnecessary because it was necessary. She said, "All right." He came by the next day and patched the roof. She fed him lunch. He went home. This became, over the following weeks, something like a pattern, not a scheduled arrangement. Nothing with that kind of declared intention, but a rhythm of proximity that grew naturally from the fact that they were the nearest neighbors on the ridge, and from the fact that the frontier threw problems at you continuously, and 2 sets of hands solved them more efficiently than one. She was aware of what she was feeling. She had been alive long enough and honest enough with herself to name it plainly. She was developing feelings for Jasper Trask, and they were not the mild, neighborly feelings she might have preferred. They were the unsettling, attention-consuming kind that reminded her of being 22 years old and newly arrived in Virginia from her parents' home in Richmond, the kind that made it difficult to concentrate on whatever she was supposed to be concentrating on. She did not tell him this. She was not ready. And then December came, and with it the information that reshaped everything she thought she understood about the quiet man on the Harker place. It came from an unlikely source, a traveling salesman named Chet Morris who stopped overnight at Dry Creek on his way west from Topeka and who happened, over supper at the town's single eating establishment, to mention that he had come through Pueblo, Colorado the previous summer, and that he had heard a story there about a man named Jasper Trask. Maria was eating alone at the far end of the table when she heard the name. She set down her fork and listened. Chet Morris, who had a salesman's instinct for a captive audience, told the story with relish. Jasper Trask, he said, had been a trapper and guide of considerable reputation in southern Colorado. He had also been for 3 years the husband of a woman named Clara, a woman who by all accounts had been remarkable clever, fearless, beloved by everyone who knew her. They had built a cabin in the mountains above Pueblo, and in the winter of 1872, Clara Trask had been taken ill with pneumonia. Morris leaned forward over the table. His voice went lower, the way voices do when a story turns toward its hard part. By the time Jasper Trask had understood how sick his wife was, they were snowed in. The passes were closed. The nearest doctor was in Pueblo, 40 miles below, and the snow was coming down so thick and constant that the trail was invisible, and the drifts were chest-high in places. He had tried to go for help. He had made it 3 miles before the storm drove him back. Clara Trask had died in their mountain cabin on a January night in 1872, with her husband unable to do anything except hold her hand and speak to her and watch the fever take her. Chet Morris shook his head and picked up his coffee cup. They say he came down from those mountains in the spring changed, didn't speak for 2 weeks after he got to Pueblo. Spent that whole summer up there alone before he finally sold the cabin and came east. He paused. Heard he blames himself, though nobody with any sense would. Maria Bell sat very still at the end of the table for a long time after the salesman moved on to other topics. She understood now what he had meant by needing level ground for a while. She understood the fence and the firewood and the split wood on her porch, understood them not as the gestures of a man who wanted something from her, but as the gestures of a man who had learned, at the highest possible cost, what it meant to be unable to prevent harm from reaching someone who mattered. She understood why he watched the horizon with those gray eyes, why he was always aware of the state of every practical system around him, why he had noticed her horse's shoe from 10 feet away. He was a man who had been living with a dark past so heavy it had bent him, and he had come to Kansas to try to stand up straight again. She did not go to him that night. She went home and lay awake in the cold dark and thought about Clara Trask, about grief that had no outlet, about the particular cruelty of losing someone not to violence or accident, but to the indifferent arithmetic of geography and weather and insufficient help. She thought about Thomas Bell, too, about the way grief stacked up in a person, layer by layer, until you were carrying a weight that had no shape and no name, but that never for a single moment got lighter. She went to sleep finally, and in the morning she put on her coat and walked across the field to the Harker cabin. He answered the door with a rifle at his side, not raised, just present, the reflex of a man who had learned caution in the mountains. And then he saw it was her, and set it against the wall and opened the door wider. "Maria, I heard about Clara," she said. "I'm not coming to pity you. I'm coming because I think you should know that I understand something about what that kind of loss does to a person, and because I have been," she paused, choosing the word carefully, "because I have been less than honest with you about why I value your company." He looked at her for a long moment. The morning light was gray and flat behind her. His jaw worked slightly, the way a man's jaw does when he is holding something in that badly wants to come out. "Come inside," he said. She came inside. They sat at his table, which was rougher than hers, and had a stack of maps on one side that she noted were of the Kansas plains and not the Colorado mountains. And she told him about Thomas Bell, not the eulogy version she offered to passing strangers, but the real version, the one that included the particular specific quality of the loneliness that had followed his death. The kind of loneliness that was not just the absence of company but the absence of someone who knew you, someone with whom you had built a shared language. He listened to all of it without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "I have been thinking about you more than is appropriate for a neighbor." She almost smiled. "Almost? So have I," she said, "about you." They sat with that for a while, the way two people sit with a truth they have just spoken out loud for the first time, feeling its weight and its texture and wondering what it will cost them. "I'm not," he said carefully, "without complications." "Neither am I," she said. "I have a tendency," he said, "to want to fix things, to prevent things. It comes from—" He stopped, started again. "I could not save Clara. I have spent 2 years trying to figure out what kind of man that makes me, and the honest answer is that I don't know yet. It makes you a man who loved someone and could not prevent the unpreventable," Maria said. "That is the only kind of loss that has no comfortable resolution." He looked at her across the table. "How did you get so clear-sighted?" 2 years alone on a quarter section," she said. "There is a great deal of time to think." He reached across the table and put his hand over hers, and she let him, and they sat that way for a long time in the gray December light of the cabin on the eastern ridge, and Maria Bell felt the wall she had so carefully maintained begin, not crumble. She was not a woman given to crumbling but shift, adjust, make room. They began, after that, to be deliberately in each other's company. Not secretly. There was no reason for secrecy. They were adults and widowed and free to do as they chose, but with the particular deliberateness of two people who have been hurt before and are choosing, consciously, to step toward risk rather than away from it. He began coming to her homestead in the evenings twice a week, bringing whatever he had trapped or shot, and she began cooking enough for two. They talked through supper and afterward, sitting at the table with the lamp between them, working through the immense archive of things each of them had been thinking about in solitude for 2 years. He told her about growing up in Ohio, the son of a schoolteacher who had moved the family west when Jasper was 12, about the way the plains had opened up in front of him like a promise he had not known he was waiting for. He told her about the years in Colorado, about the Rockies in all their complicated beauty, about the life he and Clara had been building, and what it had felt like to lose the shape of it overnight. She told him about Richmond, about the Virginia that existed before the war and the one that existed after it, about the particular way the Civil War had ended her parents' world without quite ending it, leaving them in a kind of suspended grief for a civilization that was gone, but that they could not bring themselves to stop mourning. She told him about meeting Thomas Bell, about the decision to come west, about what it had felt like to watch the land on that quarter section begin to yield to her hands. "You love this land," he said one night. "I love what it required of me," she said. "I came here not knowing anything and I learned everything here. That creates a kind of attachment." To the land or to who you became on it. She thought about that. Both. They're the same thing, aren't they? He smiled at her across the lamp. He had a smile that appeared rarely and meant something when it did, not the easy social smile of a man trying to put people at ease, but the kind of smile that a person produces when they encounter something that genuinely delights them, as though they had not expected to be delighted and are slightly surprised by it. She was falling in love with him. She knew it in December, and by January she had stopped pretending not to know it. The question was what to do with the knowledge. What she did not do was tell him, not directly, not yet. What she did instead was continue the evenings and the shared work and the conversations, and she paid attention to the accumulating evidence of what he felt, evidence that she read the way she read, whether, not in single signs but in patterns, in the accumulation of small, consistent data points that added up to something she could trust. The patterns were clear. The way he watched her when she was not looking, which she noticed via reflections and peripheral vision because she was Maria Bell and she noticed things. The way he had begun bringing flowers, not in any dramatic gesture, just wildflowers tucked into the firewood he still sometimes brought, dried goldenrod and prairie aster, as though he had found them and thought she might like them, and there was no reason not to bring them. The way he had begun saying her name with a particular quality that she could not have described in words but that she felt in her chest every single time. She was doing the same things back at him, she knew. The extra care with the food. The fact that she had mended one of his shirts, without being asked, when she noticed a torn seam. The way she had started laughing, more actually laughing, not the polite social kind but the real kind, the kind that came out of you before you could stop it. It was the laughter that finally broke it open. It was a February evening, very cold, and they were playing cards at her table, and she had won 3 hands in a row by what she maintained was skill, and he maintained was cheating. And she laughed so hard at his expression, pure exasperated disbelief, that she knocked the lamp sideways and they both lunged for it at the same moment, and his hand closed over hers on the lamp base, and they were suddenly very close together in the small yellow light, and neither of them moved. He said very quietly, "Maria," she said, equally quietly, "I know." And then he kissed her and she kissed him back, and the lamp stood safely on the table, and the February wind worked at the edges of the cabin, and Maria Bell felt something inside her she had been holding closed for 2 years release, slowly, like a hand unclenching. They were careful with each other after that. Neither of them was young and untested. They were both people who had been broken and repaired, and who knew the difference between the heat of a moment and the weight of a promise. They did not rush. They continued the evenings, the shared work, the conversations, but now there were also the things that came with acknowledged feeling. The hand held when they walked between buildings on cold mornings, the way he tilted his head down toward her when they stood together, the particular quality of attention he gave her when she spoke, as though her words were something worth treasuring. She was happier than she had been in 2 years. She was also, if she was honest, frightened. Not of him. He had given her every reason to trust him, and her instincts about people were good, but of the vulnerability of happiness itself, of the way having something wonderful meant having something to lose. She did not say this to him, but he appeared to know it anyway, because one evening in March he said, without preamble, "I am not going anywhere." She looked up from the mending she was doing. He was reading the newspaper from Abilene, 2 weeks old, the way all their news was. He was not looking at her. "I need you to know that," he said. "Whatever happened before, I am here. I am choosing to be here, and I intend to keep choosing it." She looked at him for a long moment. He turned the newspaper page with the steady attention of a man who has said what he needed to say and is leaving it to its own consequences. "I know," she said. It was spring by the time things moved between them toward a declared future. April, the prairie coming green in that sudden, startling way it did after the gray endlessness of winter, and Jasper Trask standing at her fence line one afternoon watching a red-tailed hawk circle over the north field, and Maria coming up beside him and standing there watching it too, and him saying, without taking his eyes off the hawk, "I would like to build something here, with you, if that is what you want." "I want that," she said. He turned and looked at her. "I mean permanent." "So do I," he exhaled, a long breath she understood was the release of something he had been holding for a while. Then he said, "All right," and took her hand, and the hawk banked and turned and rode the thermal south and out of sight over the ridge. They set a date in June for a simple ceremony before the circuit preacher who came through Dry Creek 4 times a year. They told the postmaster and the general store owner and their nearest neighbors, a farm family named the Andersons whose homestead was 8 miles to the south, and the news moved through the scattered community of the Smoky Hills with the velocity that news always moved in isolated country, fast and thorough, and accompanied by strong opinions from everyone who heard it. Most of the opinions were positive. Elwood Pitts, the postmaster, told Maria that he thought it was wonderful and that Jasper Trask was a decent man. The Andersons, who had watched Maria manage her homestead alone for 2 years with unspoken admiration, sent word that they were delighted and would attend the ceremony. There were a handful of voices, there always were, who thought a widow remarrying too quickly was unseemly, or who had heard enough about the mountain man from Colorado to cultivate unfounded suspicions about his intentions. Maria Bell gave these voices precisely the attention they deserved, which was none. She was happy. She was choosing to be happy. That was the most radical act she had ever performed. And then, one morning in the 3rd week of April, 6 weeks before the June wedding date, she woke up with a headache. She had been working hard, the spring planting was underway, which meant long days in the field, and she had been helping Jasper with repairs to the Harker cabin, which he intended to sell so they could add the proceeds to her land claim and perhaps expand the farm. The headache made sense. She had a cup of coffee and got to work. By afternoon, the headache was worse. By evening, she had a temperature. By the following morning, she could not stand up. The fever came on with a speed and ferocity that frightened her, which was not easy to do. She had dealt with illness on the frontier before, a bad winter cold 2 years ago, a stomach complaint the previous summer, but this was different in kind. This was the kind of sick that lived deep, that made the light feel like pain and the room tip and wheel and the simplest thought dissolve before she could complete it. She managed to get herself to the door of her cabin and push it open, which was when the outdoor air hit her and her legs simply stopped working, and she went down in the dirt of her own yard. She was not sure how long she lay there. Long enough for the sun to move. Long enough for the dirt to become familiar against her cheek. She was burning and shivering simultaneously, which she recognized dimly as a bad sign. And she was thinking with the fragmented logic of high fever about the wheat she had not got in and about a letter she had promised to write to her mother in Virginia and about Jasper, who was working at the Harker cabin today and would not come to her homestead until evening, which meant hours. She did not know it, but Jasper had looked at the sky that morning and felt something he had learned to trust, an instinctive knowledge that something was wrong. He had not been able to articulate why. The sky was clear. The birds were behaving normally. The prairie was quiet in its ordinary April morning way. But the feeling had sat on his chest all morning like a stone, and by noon it had grown heavy enough that he had put down his tools and walked the half-mile between the Harker cabin and her homestead. He came through the gate in her fence line and saw her lying in the dirt, and his body moved before his mind had fully caught up with what he was seeing. He crossed the yard at a run. He dropped to his knees beside her and put his hand on her face, and the heat of her skin hit him like a blow. Maria. He turned her gently onto her back. Her eyes were half open and unresponsive. "Maria, can you hear me?" She said something he could not make out. Her lips were cracked and dry. Her skin was the color of ash and hot to the touch everywhere he checked. He knew what this was. He had felt this particular cold clarity before, the moment when someone you love is in danger that you do not yet know how to measure. He had felt it in the mountain winter of 1872, watching Clara struggle to breathe. He had felt the paralysis that came with it then, the terrible helplessness of a man in a wilderness with no resources. He was not paralyzed now. He had spent 2 years learning not to be paralyzed by this. He went into her cabin and soaked a cloth in the water bucket and came back and pressed it to her forehead and lifted her and got water into her, a little enough. He assessed what he knew about her condition with the rapid, methodical efficiency of a man who had spent years in wilderness situations where assessment was the difference between life and death. She was running a very high fever. She was not fully conscious. She had been lying in the sun for probably 2 hours. He assessed his resources. His horse had thrown a shoe that morning. He had pulled the shoe when it started to come loose, meaning the horse was not fit to ride on hard ground until it was reshod. The nearest farrier was in Dry Creek, 9 miles away. Maria had a horse, but it was a cart horse, not built for speed, and he had ridden it once and knew its pace. The nearest doctor was not in Dry Creek, which only had a barber who sometimes set bones, but in Abilene, which was the closest real town with a proper physician, and Abilene was 41 miles away across the Flint Hills and the Smoky Hill River. He stood up. He looked at the distance. He felt the weight of what was required. Then he went inside her cabin and found a blanket and came back outside and wrapped her in it and picked her up. He was a large man, and he was strong in the specific way of men who work with their bodies in demanding environments. Not just muscled but efficient, the kind of strong that comes from years of practical use and has very little waste in it. Maria Bell was 5 feet 6 inches and lean from 2 years of frontier work, and he picked her up as though she weighed nothing and held her against his chest and started walking. East, toward Abilene. He walked. The first miles went through the familiar country of his own days, the ridge, the creek crossing, the long slope of the Flint Hills beginning to rise in front of him. He walked at the pace of a man who knows he cannot afford to hurry so fast he breaks down, but who also knows there is no acceptable alternative to continuous forward motion. Maria drifted in and out of awareness against his chest. Sometimes she spoke fragmentary things, a name he did not recognize, a question about wheat, his name once very clearly as though she had surfaced briefly into full consciousness and reached for the most certain thing she knew. "I'm here," he said each time. "I have you. We're going to Abilene." The afternoon light changed and the long Kansas evening began, and he kept walking. He ate the hardtack from his coat pocket without stopping. He washed her face with creek water at the ford and got more water into her and kept moving. He crossed the Smoky Hill River as the sun went down. The water was cold and hip-deep at the ford, and he held her up and got himself and her across without going under, and the cold water was almost a relief after the hours of walking. He came up the east bank and kept moving. He walked through the night. He would not talk about these hours later, not because they were too painful to revisit, but because he genuinely found them difficult to describe. There was the dark, and the cold, and the steady rhythm of his own boots on the earth, and the woman in his arms burning with fever that seemed to neither break nor worsen, but simply continue. There were the stars, which were extraordinary that night, filling the sky from horizon to horizon with the kind of abundance you only saw far from any town. There was his own breathing, which he kept deliberate and measured. There was the occasional small sound she made, and the way he spoke to her each time, not with any particular words but with his voice, offering her the continual reassurance that he was there, that they were moving, that it was going to be all right. He told himself this too. He needed to hear it as much as she did. Dawn came. He was somewhere in the middle of the 3rd County, perhaps 10 miles from Abilene, and he had been walking for approximately 15 hours. His arms ached with a deep bone ache that he observed with the detachment of a man who has decided that physical pain is not relevant information. His feet were blistered inside his boots. He was hungry in the abstract way of a body that has been working too hard for too long to waste resources on the sensation. Maria's fever was still high, but her breathing had steadied. He told himself that was progress and kept walking. He came into Abilene in the middle of the morning, walking down the main street of the cattle town with a woman in his arms, and the people he passed stopped and stared with the various expressions that people produce when they witness something outside the ordinary. A cowhand on the porch of the saloon, a woman hanging laundry at the side of the hotel, 2 men talking outside the leather goods shop who simply fell silent and watched him pass. He asked the first person who came toward him with purposeful expression where the doctor was. The man, a shopkeeper, from his apron pointed down the street and said, "Dr. Holloway, end of the block." Jasper Trask carried Maria Bell down the block and through the door of the doctor's office without knocking. Dr. Holloway was a compact man in his 50s, with the precise, unhurried manner of a physician who had seen most things. He took one look at the woman in Jasper's arms and stood up from his desk and said, "Put her on the cot." Jasper put her on the cot. The doctor examined her with quick, efficient hands. He looked at the color of her skin and the dryness of her lips and the quality of her breathing and the heat emanating from her. He looked up at Jasper. "How long has she been like this?" "Since yesterday morning. I found her around noon." "And you walked from where?" "From the ridge east of Dry Creek." The doctor's expression did not change, but something moved in his eyes. He turned back to Maria and said, "This is septicemia. Blood poisoning. There's an infection in her bloodstream. It's serious." He paused. "But she's alive and she's strong. That counts for a great deal." "What do you need?" Jasper said. "I need you to let me work," the doctor said. "And I need you to sit down before you fall down." Jasper sat. He sat in the wooden chair beside the cot and he put his hat on his knee and he looked at the door while the doctor worked, because looking at the door meant looking away from Maria, which was the only way he could maintain the controlled stillness the situation required. He did not leave. For 3 days, through the periodic moments when the doctor sent him outside to eat or sleep briefly in the chair in the waiting room, he was in or immediately adjacent to that room. He ate what was brought to him without tasting it. He slept in fragments, waking at any change in the sound of her breathing. He answered the doctor's questions about her symptoms and her history, and when she had last eaten and drunk and what she had been doing before she collapsed. The doctor treated the infection with what he had available: quinine, carbolic acid solution, applied externally, forced fluids, careful monitoring of her temperature. It was the standard treatment of the era, and it was limited, and the first 2 days were genuinely uncertain. The fever spiked and came down and spiked again, and the doctor sat with her through the nights, and Jasper sat in the chair, and they coexisted in the silent vigil of two people waiting for the same outcome. On the morning of the 3rd day, the fever broke. The doctor came out of the room and told Jasper with the quiet satisfaction of a man who has been in this profession long enough to receive good news with gratitude rather than triumph. Jasper sat very still in the chair for a moment. Then he said, "Can I see her?" "She's sleeping," the doctor said. "She needs to sleep, but yes." He went in and sat beside the cot, and she was sleeping, still and pale and breathing with the deep, steady rhythm of someone who has come through something that required everything they had. The fever color was gone from her face. She looked like herself. He looked at her for a long time. He thought about Clara, which he always did in moments like this, and this time the thought was not the usual double-edged thing, half grief, half guilt, but something more like resolution. He had walked 41 miles. He had got here in time. He had done the thing he had not been able to do in 1872, and it had worked, and she was going to be all right. He exhaled slowly and put his hat back on his knee. She woke on the evening of the 3rd day. She opened her eyes and the ceiling of a room she did not recognize presented itself, white and still, and then she turned her head and there was Jasper in the wooden chair looking at the door. "Jasper," she said. Her voice came out rough and quiet, but it was her voice. He turned immediately and looked at her and the expression on his face. The one he had not been able to fully contain, the one that let out everything he had been carrying for 3 days, would stay with her for the rest of her life as one of the most important things she had ever seen on a human face. It was relief so profound it was almost painful to witness. It was love unguarded and undisguised in the face of a man who did not usually allow himself to be unguarded. "Maria," he said. It was only her name, just those 2 syllables, but they contained a book's worth of what had happened and what he felt about it. "Where are we?" she said. "Abilene, Dr. Holloway's office." She processed this. "How did we get here?" "I walked." She looked at him. "From the homestead." "From the homestead." She held this fact in her mind, turning it over slowly, feeling its dimensions. 41 miles, 3 counties, through the night and into the morning, with her in his arms, burning with a fever that might have killed her without a doctor's intervention. "You walked," she said again, not a question this time, just the fact being said out loud so it would be real. "I did," he said. "There wasn't another option that I was willing to consider." She felt something move through her that had no exact name. Gratitude was part of it, but gratitude was too simple, too transactional. This was something wider. This was the feeling of being chosen, deliberately and at great cost, by someone who understood exactly what the cost was. She reached out her hand. He took it, both hands around hers, careful. "You should sleep more," he said. "The doctor said you need." "Jasper," she said, "be quiet for a moment." He was quiet. "I love you," she said. "I have been intending to tell you that for a while. I am telling you now because I nearly died before I got the chance, and I find that I object to that possibility very strongly." He looked at her for a long moment. The lamp on the desk made his face warm, and the gray eyes that had always given her the impression of looking at something very far away were looking at her with absolute nearness. "I love you," he said. "I have been saying it in every other possible way since December, and I should have said it plainly before now." "Yes," she said, "you should have." He almost smiled. She almost smiled back. Then she closed her eyes because she was exhausted, and he held her hand and she went back to sleep. And this time the sleep was quiet, and when she woke in the morning the fever was gone. The recovery took 2 weeks. The doctor insisted on it: 2 weeks of rest, adequate food, no strenuous activity, regular monitoring of her temperature to ensure the infection was fully cleared. Maria, who was not accustomed to stillness, found this more difficult than the illness itself. She was a woman built for action, and the inactivity chafed at her. Jasper, who had gone to the livery on the morning after she regained consciousness, and arranged to have his horse brought from Dry Creek by a willing rider, and who had then arranged a temporary room at the hotel while Maria recovered, became during those 2 weeks something he had apparently always been capable of being, but had kept mostly hidden: patient and gentle and quietly funny. All the things she had glimpsed in the evenings at her table now on full display in the unhurried time of a recovery. He read to her. She had not expected this. He produced a copy of David Copperfield from somewhere. She later discovered he had bought it at the Abilene General Store specifically, and read to her in the evenings while she sat up in the cot and Dr. Holloway checked in periodically with the patient, contained satisfaction of a man whose treatment had worked. He read Dickens with the same quality of voice he used for everything: unhurried, deliberate, giving each sentence its full weight, and she lay in the recovery cot in the doctor's back room and listened and felt herself healing. She also, during those 2 weeks, learned more about him. The unhurried time generated conversations they had not had before: longer, more detailed, more willing to go to the places they usually approached carefully and then backed away from. She told him about her parents, about the war years in Virginia, about the specific texture of the kind of grief that comes from watching a world you love dismantle itself. She told him about the moments in the months after Thomas's death when she had genuinely doubted her decision to stay on the homestead, the dark private hours when the solitude felt less like strength and more like the particular stubborn pride of someone who would rather suffer alone than admit they might need help. He told her about his father. He had not talked much about his father, had mentioned him briefly in the early December conversations, and then moved on. Now he told her more, and she understood that the move from Ohio had not been the uncomplicated adventure she had imagined. His father had been a man who believed in the frontier as a second chance, a man who had made mistakes in Ohio that he was running from, debts and a failed business, and the particular humiliation of public failure in a small community. The family had not moved west because of opportunity exactly, but because they had run out of options east. He was not a bad man, Jasper said. He was a frightened one, which is its own kind of difficult to live with. He expected the West to fix things that no geography can fix. Did it fix things? Some things, he said. He died when I was 20, and I think by then he was at peace with himself, or near enough. The mountains do something to your sense of proportion. Hard to carry your private failures against the scale of the Rockies. Is that why you went there? The Rockies? Partly, he said. Partly because I needed to find out what I was made of, and the mountains have a way of telling you." He paused. "I was 22 when I went up. Came back down more or less when I was 28 after Clara." He looked at the lamp. "I am 30 now and I am still in the process of finding out." She looked at him across the small room. "What you did," she said, "walking here, that told you something." He met her eyes. "Yes," he said, "it did." What it had told him, she suspected, was something about the difference between the guilt he had been carrying, the irrational, consuming guilt of a man who survived when his wife did not, and the practical reality of his own capacity. He had been unable to save Clara because the situation had not allowed for saving. He had been able to get Maria to Abilene because the situation, though brutal, had not closed every avenue. The outcome was different not because of different love but because of different circumstances. She suspected he had been waiting 2 years for the chance to prove this to himself. She did not say any of this out loud. He was not a man who needed to have his emotional processes narrated for him. She said instead, "We were talking about the wedding date," which made him laugh, actually laugh, the real kind, and that was better than analysis anyway. They adjusted the wedding date. The June ceremony at Dry Creek was pushed back to late July to allow for Maria's full recovery and the journey back west. They wrote to the circuit preacher explaining the delay. They wrote to the Andersons. Maria wrote to her mother in Virginia, a letter she had been composing in her head for most of the recovery period. She told her mother about Jasper Trask. She told her about the fever and the walk and the 3 days in the doctor's office. She told her mother that she was going to marry this man, and that she would like her mother to know that she was happy, genuinely happy, the kind that does not need to be carefully managed. Her mother wrote back 6 weeks later, the letter finding them at the homestead after the wedding was done, with a single sentence that Maria read 3 times and then pressed between the pages of her Bible. "Your father and I are very glad you stayed." The ride back from Abilene was taken slowly, Maria on her horse and Jasper on his, moving at an easy pace through the Flint Hills in the green abundance of May. She had lost weight during the illness and was not yet fully at her strength, but she was recovered, and the prairie in May was a different thing from the prairie in October. It was alive in a way that felt almost aggressive, the grass coming in thick and green, wildflowers in the lowlands, the sky doing the enormous, limitless thing it did in Kansas that never stopped being astonishing no matter how long you had been there. She rode beside him through it and felt the particular quality of contentment that comes from having survived something and emerged on the other side of it with more than you had going in. "What are you thinking?" he said. He asked this sometimes, not intrusively, just with the genuine interest of a person who wanted to know. "I'm thinking about the farm," she said. "The spring wheat will need attention when we get back. And I want to expand the kitchen garden this year. I've been thinking about it since winter and I never did anything about it." He considered this. "I could build you a better cold cellar this summer. The one you have now won't handle the volume if you expand the garden." She looked at him. "You have been thinking about my cold cellar." "I have been thinking about what you'll need," he said. "There's a difference but not much of one." She smiled. The prairie unrolled around them. They rode. The wedding was on the 28th of July, 1874. The circuit preacher was a man named Reverend Aldrich, lean and sunburned and possessed of a straightforward theology that suited the practical religion of frontier people. He performed the ceremony in the yard of the Dry Creek Church, a small wooden building that served also as a schoolroom 3 days a week, with the Andersons and their 3 children in attendance, and Elwood Pitts, and the general store owner whose name was Maggie Holden. A sturdy woman of 40 who had come to Kansas as a young widow and built a business from nothing, and who looked at Maria and Jasper with the expression of someone who had seen this particular kind of happy before and knew exactly what it was worth. Maria wore her best dress, which was dark blue calico she had bought in Abilene during her recovery. Jasper wore the suit he had acquired for the purpose in Dry Creek, slightly too short in the leg, which made him look exactly like a mountain man who had put on a suit, which was what he was and which she found entirely charming. He had cut his hair. He looked at her when she came out of the church's small side room, and the expression on his face was something she filed away in the same category as the one she had seen when she woke up in Abilene. The private Jasper Trask expressions that were not for general distribution. Reverend Aldrich read the vows in a carrying voice. They repeated them in the clean Kansas morning air, and Maria Bell became Maria Trask, and Jasper Trask became the husband of Maria Bell. And the Andersons clapped, and their children ran in circles, and Elwood Pitts wept in the straightforward way of postmasters who have heard the whole story and feel invested in the outcome. Maggie Holden had organized a wedding meal in the churchyard, cold chicken and cornbread, and pie made from dried apples, eaten at tables dragged outside into the July sunshine. There was lemonade, which was a considerable luxury that far west, and the afternoon was the particular kind of slow and golden that July afternoons in Kansas could be, when the heat was present but not brutal, and the air smelled of grass, and the wide-open quality of the plains felt like possibility rather than exposure. They rode back to the homestead as the afternoon tipped toward evening, 2 people and 2 horses on the same trail Maria had ridden alone for 2 years, and the familiar landmarks took on a different character from this direction. The ridge, the fence line Jasper had repaired in October, the barn and the house and the yard where she had collapsed in April. She stopped her horse at the yard gate and looked at the house. "What is it?" he said, coming up beside her. "I'm just thinking that this place is different than it was," she said. "Not the buildings, just the way it feels." He looked at the house too. "Claimed," he said. "Yes," she said, "exactly that." They went inside. The house was the same house she had built her solitary life in, and it was about to become something different, something shared. And the transition from one to the other was not a loss but an addition, a layering, and Maria Trask felt the rightness of it in the particular deep way that things feel right when they are the outcome of deliberate choices made with open eyes. The first year of their marriage was what first years on the frontier always were: hard work and learning, and the discovery of each other in the daily specific ways that courtship does not reveal. They discovered that he woke before dawn without any apparent effort, and that she did not, and reached an accommodation on this. They discovered that she had stronger opinions about the management of the wheat rotation than he had initially understood, and he had stronger opinions about the management of the cattle grazing than she had expected, and they negotiated, with the good faith efficiency of 2 people who respected each other's competence. They discovered that they had compatible temperaments in the matters that mattered most: the practical, the ethical, the emotional architecture of a shared life, and that the places where they differed were interesting rather than incompatible. Jasper sold the Harker cabin claim in the spring of 1875 and put the money toward additional land on the eastern side of Maria's original homestead, expanding the farm to 320 acres. The additional land changed the economic calculus of the farm significantly. They could run more cattle, expand the wheat, and plant a small orchard on the eastern slope that Jasper had identified as having good drainage and exposure. The orchard was Maria's project. She had grown up with apple and pear trees in Virginia, and she had missed them in a way she had not acknowledged to herself, until Jasper said one day, "That eastern slope would hold fruit trees," and she had experienced a response so disproportionate to the statement that she had stood there for a moment genuinely surprised by herself. She ordered 20 young trees by mail from a nursery in Missouri, 12 apples, 4 pears, 4 cherries, and spent 3 weeks in April 1875 planting them with the kind of careful attention you give to things that will take years to reach their full potential. Jasper helped without being asked, which was characteristic of him, and they worked through the planting days together in the comfortable near silence of people who have found a way to share space that does not require filling it with words. In June of 1875, Maria confirmed what she had suspected for 6 weeks. She was pregnant. She told Jasper in the evening, after supper, sitting at the table with the lamp between them the same way they had always sat. She said it plainly, the way she said most things, and watched his face. He sat very still for a moment. Then something moved through his face in sequence: surprise, then understanding, then something she could only describe as profound, as though he had just been given information that reorganized the structure of everything he had previously understood. "You're certain," he said. "I am," she said. He stood up from the table and came around, and she stood up, and he held her in the lamplight with the careful, particular quality of a man holding something he does not quite believe is real. "Are you all right?" he said. "Are you well?" "I'm well," she said. "I'm good, I'm very good." He exhaled against her hair. She felt the tension in him, not fear exactly, but awareness, the same awareness that made him notice loose horseshoes and leaking roofs and women collapsed in yards. He was cataloging what this meant and what it required, and she let him, because that was how he processed things, and because his thoroughness was one of the things she loved most about him. "We'll need to get Dr. Holloway involved early," he said. "I don't want Jasper," she said gently. "It isn't 1872. A pause. His arms tightened briefly. "No," he said, "it isn't. And I am not fragile," she said. "You know that." "I know," he said, "but I am going to be attentive if you will allow it." "You are always attentive," she said. "It is one of your defining characteristics. I accounted for it when I married you." He laughed finally, the real laugh that she was still unreasonably delighted by, and she felt the tension in him release, and she pressed her face against his shoulder and thought about the eastern slope and the young apple trees growing slowly in the Kansas soil, and the way that some things required patience to reach the fullness of what they were always going to be. The pregnancy was hard in the first months. Nausea that the frontier did not make any allowances for. Fatigue she refused to give in to entirely, but had to accommodate. Jasper managed the farm largely on his own through the worst of it without complaint, and he wrote to Dr. Holloway in Abilene, who agreed to come out in the final weeks if the timing allowed, and who sent written guidance in the meantime on what to watch for. They also arranged for Mrs. Anderson to be present for the birth, because Sarah Anderson had delivered 3 of her own children and 2 neighbors with the calm, practical efficiency of a woman for whom this was simply another form of necessary work. The baby came in January 1876, a boy, arriving in the early morning with the purposeful efficiency that would, it turned out, characterize his entire personality. They named him Thomas James Trask Thomas for Maria's first husband, whom she honored without apology, James for Jasper's father. He was small and entire and absolutely certain of his own importance, and Jasper held him in the kitchen afterward with an expression that Maria, lying exhausted in the bedroom with Mrs. Anderson cleaning up around her, could hear in his voice when he came to the doorway. "He's very small," he said. "He'll grow," she said. "He has your eyes. He has your nose." "That's unfortunate," she laughed. She should not have laughed. Everything ached, but she could not help it. He came and sat beside the bed with the baby in his arms and the lamp burning low and outside the January wind moving across the Kansas plain, and she looked at the 2 of them in the lamplight, and she thought about the mountain man who had carried her 41 miles in his arms because there was not another option he was willing to consider. She thought about what the doctor in Abilene had told her when she was fully recovered and before they left for home. He had told her that the infection had been genuinely dangerous, that another 12 hours without treatment would have changed the outcome in ways he was not comfortable speculating about. He had looked at her over his desk and said, "You are here because of the persistence of a very remarkable man. I have practiced medicine in Kansas for 11 years, and I have never seen anything quite like it." She had looked back at him and said, "I know." She had known then. She had known every single day since. The years that followed were the years that built the shape of their life together, and they were full in the way that frontier lives were full with work and weather, and the particular satisfactions of watching something you have built slowly become more than you initially imagined it could be. The farm grew. Jasper's management of the cattle operation, combined with Maria's disciplined approach to the wheat rotation, produced results that were, by the mid-1870s, giving them a genuine economic stability that neither of them had had before. They hired a hand in 1876, a young man named Billy Royce who was 17 and had come west from Illinois with nothing but a strong back and a willingness to learn. And Jasper taught him the work with the patient thoroughness of a man who understood that knowledge was a form of generosity. The orchard took its time, as orchards do. The apple trees did not produce a meaningful crop until the spring of 1878, and when they did 32 apple trees now, because they had continued planting, Maria walked among them in the May morning and felt something she identified as vindication, though she could not have said exactly what had been in question. Jasper found her there. He came up and stood beside her in the orchard, and they looked at the trees together. "I remember planting the first ones," she said, "before Thomas was born." "I remember watching you plant them," he said. "You measured every hole. The spacing matters." "I know," he said. "I was not criticizing, I was admiring." She looked at him. 4 years of marriage had not changed the particular way he made her feel when he said things like that. It had, if anything, deepened it, settled it into something more certain than the precarious, bright feeling of the early days. Thomas was 2.5 and currently in the care of Sarah Anderson for the morning, which had been the arrangement since the Andersons' eldest daughter had turned 14 and become a reliable presence in the community. He was a confident, busy child who had inherited his father's tendency toward thoroughness and his mother's directness, and who was already demonstrating an alarming interest in taking things apart to see how they worked. "I want to plant more trees this fall," Maria said. "All right," Jasper said. "What kind?" "Plums and another 10 apples on the upper slope." "That upper slope needs clearing first." "I know," she said. "I was going to ask Billy." "I'll do it," he said. "I want to do it." She looked at him again. He was 34 now. The gray had begun to work into his dark hair at the temples, and the weathering had deepened around his eyes, and he was still the most certain-feeling person she had ever stood next to, the person who made the ground feel more solid under her feet just by being present. "You do not have to clear the slope yourself," she said. "You have a farm hand for the physical work." "I want to," he said. "I like clearing, I like understanding the land." She understood this about him. He had spent 2 years in Kansas learning the plains the way he had spent 6 years learning the Rockies with his body, through physical engagement, through the particular knowledge that came from doing rather than observing. The farm was not just a livelihood for him. It was a language he was learning. "All right," she said. He took her hand. They walked back through the orchard in the May morning, among the apple trees that had taken 4 years to reach their potential, and the Kansas sky above them was the limitless blue that was one of the finest things about the place. In 1879, Maria had her second child, a girl this time, which delighted Thomas beyond what might have been expected of a 3-year-old boy, and which was, Maria thought, entirely consistent with his character. They named her Clara Eleanor Trask. Clara for Jasper's first wife, because Maria had never been a woman who required the past to be erased in order to be secure in the present, and Eleanor for Maria's grandmother, a Virginia woman of formidable character whose photograph sat on the shelf above the fireplace. Jasper held Clara Eleanor on the evening of her birth with the same wide-eyed wonder he had held Thomas, but with a quality added to it now, a kind of peace that Maria recognized as the specific peace of a man who has come to terms with the thing that nearly broke him. He had named his daughter after his first wife, and the naming had not been painful. It had been, she thought, something like completion. "Clara," he said softly. "Hello, Clara." The baby looked up at him with the unfocused intensity of the newborn, and he looked back at her, and Maria watched them from the bed, and felt the quiet fullness of a life that had required so much and given so much in return. She thought, as she often did in these large moments, about the woman who had walked alone on this land for 16 months, about the walls she had built around herself and the methodical way she had maintained them, about the October morning she had come out to find her fence repaired by someone who was not yet anything to her except a name from a postmaster and a neighbor who preferred his own company. She had not known, that October morning, that the man who repaired her fence was a man who had walked 41 miles through 3 counties with a woman in his arms, because he was not willing to let the frontier take another person from him. She had not known that his whole complicated history, Clara, the mountains, the 2 years of grief and reconstruction, had brought him to the eastern ridge of the Smoky Hills specifically so that when April came and she collapsed in her yard, he would be close enough to find her. She had come to believe in the years since that what she thought of as her solitude, the deliberate self-contained life she had built after Thomas died, had actually been a kind of waiting. Not passive waiting, not sitting in a room hoping for rescue, but the active forward-moving kind of waiting that looks like getting on with things and is only recognizable in retrospect. She had been building herself into the person who could stand beside Jasper Trask, and he, without knowing it, had been building himself into the person who could walk 41 miles without setting down the thing that mattered. The decade turned. The 1880s came to the Smoky Hills of Kansas. Billy Royce, who had come to them as a boy of 17, was now a man of 24 who had proven himself so thoroughly that Jasper had offered him a share in the operation's profits, which Billy had accepted with the composed dignity of someone who had always known his own worth and was glad to have it formally recognized. He had also, in the spring of 1881, married a young woman from Abilene named Rose who had come west to teach school and had found, among other things, that the country grew on you. Thomas, at 5, was the kind of child who made adults simultaneously exhausted and delighted curious about everything, afraid of nothing, possessed of a 4-year-old's logic and a 40-year-old's confidence. He had taken to following his father around the farm with the focused intentionality of someone receiving an important education, and Jasper taught him things in the same unhurried, thorough way he did everything, treating the child's questions with the seriousness they deserved. Maria watched this and felt something that did not have a precise name, but that was the finest thing she knew. She watched her husband crouch down in the field beside their son and explain the way winter wheat grew, and she thought about all the different forms of saving there were, the dramatic kind, with 41 miles and a fever and a doctor in Abilene, and the daily quiet kind, which was what they were doing for each other every morning they woke up on the same land. She had told the story of the walk to Thomas when he was old enough to understand it, which was around 4 years old. She had told it plainly and without embellishment, because the facts were sufficient. She had told him that his father had found her sick and had carried her to get help because there was no other way. Thomas had listened with the focused attention he gave to things that mattered to him. Then he had looked at Jasper and said, with the directness of a child, "You walked all the way." "All the way," Jasper said. Thomas thought about this. "Because you love her," he said, not a question. "Yes," Jasper said, "because I love her." Thomas nodded once, satisfied, and went back to what he had been doing, which was an investigation of the mechanics of the water pump. The matter was settled. It made sense. It did make sense. That was the thing about it that Maria had returned to in her thinking over and over through the years. Not the heroism of it. She was not a woman who thought in those terms, and she suspected Jasper would have been embarrassed by the word. But the sense of it. The logic of a person who has been taught by the harshest possible education about what happens when you cannot get help in time, who encounters a situation where help can be obtained if someone is willing to pay the cost, and who does not hesitate over the cost. He had been paying forward the debt he felt he owed to a woman who had died in a mountain cabin in 1872. And in paying it forward he had, without either of them planning it, saved not just her life but the life they were going to build together. She had never forgotten it. She was never going to forget it. Not because it was a debt. she did not experience it as a debt. It was not the kind of thing that placed obligation between people who loved each other, but because it was the most complete expression she had ever witnessed of what it actually meant to choose someone. Not the choosing you did on a good day when it was easy, but the choosing you did when it cost you everything you had to give, and you gave it anyway because the alternative was not acceptable to you. That was who Jasper Trask was. She had known versions of this about him from the beginning: the fence, the firewood, the steady presence of a man who showed his love in practical, consistent, costly action. But the walk had made it fully visible in a way that she held like a lamp in every subsequent room of their life together. In the late summer of 1882, they rode together to Abilene for the first time since the illness of 1874. It was a different kind of trip. The railway had come to Abilene in the 1860s, and the town had grown and changed significantly, and they were coming to purchase equipment and to see Dr. Holloway, who was still practicing and who Maria had written to several times over the years and considered something between a professional contact and a friend. They went to his office on the second morning. Dr. Holloway was grayer than Maria remembered, but as precise and composed as ever. He shook Jasper's hand and took Maria's and looked at them both with the particular satisfaction of a doctor looking at evidence that his work has been worthwhile. "You look well," he said to Maria. "I am very well," she said. "The family is well," Jasper said. "2 children." The doctor smiled in the measured way he smiled. "And the farm?" "Growing," Maria said. They sat for a while in his office and talked, the comfortable conversation of people who share a significant history and have not let enough time pass between them to make the history feel distant. Dr. Holloway asked about the children and the farm, and they told him. He told them about the changes in Abilene, the way the cattle trade had shifted since the railway extended further west, the way the town was becoming something different from the rough cattle stop it had been. Before they left, Maria said, "I have wanted to say something to you properly for a long time." The doctor looked at her. "You saved my life," she said. "Jasper got me here, but you saved my life. I know what the outcome would have been otherwise, and I want you to know that I understand that and that I have been grateful for it every single day." The doctor was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I was doing my work. Your husband is the one you should be thanking." "I thank him every day," she said. "I am thanking you now." He nodded once, accepting it with the same composed practicality with which he had treated her. Then he looked at Jasper and said, "You know, in 11 years of practice in Kansas, I have seen a great many things. That morning is still the one I think about most when I try to explain to younger practitioners why the work matters." He paused. "A man who walks 41 miles with a woman in his arms because that is what the situation requires." Another pause. "The situation requires a great deal of physicians also, of course, but it starts with someone deciding that no option is unavailable and then using everyone he has." Jasper said, "The outcome did the explaining." "Yes," the doctor said, "it did." They rode back to the homestead from Abilene on a clear August morning, through the country they had crossed 8 years before under circumstances so different they seemed to belong to another life. The Flint Hills were tawny and quiet in the late summer. The Smoky Hill River was low at the ford. The sky was doing its enormous thing above them. They rode side by side through the hills and across the river and through the familiar country of their own place, and Maria looked at the ridge in the distance and the fence line and the shape of the buildings and felt the accumulated weight of everything that had happened here. The solitude, the fever, the walk, the recovery, the wedding, the years of work, the children, the orchard, all of it, as something not heavy but whole. Something that had come together in the way that things come together when each individual piece was meant to be part of the larger shape. "You are quiet," Jasper said. "I am thinking," she said. "About what?" She looked at him. The afternoon light was full and golden, and it lay on his face the way it lay on the hills, finding the angles and making them clear. "About the fact that we are here," she said, "and what it took to be here." He rode beside her for a moment in silence. Then he said, "I think about it too, sometimes." "What do you think?" "I think," he said carefully, "that the things that are worth the most are the ones that required the most to arrive at, not because suffering is good in itself, but because anything that has cost you everything has a quality to it that easier things do not have." He paused. "This," he made a small gesture that encompassed the hills and the trail and her. "This has that quality." "Yes," she said, "it does." They rode home. The homestead in the late afternoon had the look it had been slowly acquiring over 8 years of care and expansion, more established, more rooted, the buildings dark and solid against the yellowing grass, the orchard a distinct green mass on the eastern slope, the kitchen garden still producing in the summer abundance. The barn had been enlarged twice. There was a new well. The cold cellar Jasper had built in the summer of 1875 was exactly as deep and well constructed as he had intended. Thomas and Clara ran out as they rode through the gate, the way they always ran out when their parents returned from anywhere, and the horses stepped carefully around the children, while Maria and Jasper dismounted, and Thomas immediately began telling his father something complicated about what had happened with the water trough while they were gone, and Clara wrapped herself around Maria's leg in the straightforward way she expressed herself. And the ordinary beautiful noise of it all was the finest thing in the world. Billy Royce came out of the barn and took the horses. Rose, his wife, appeared in the doorway of their small house on the western edge of the homestead and raised a hand in greeting. The evening was coming in warm and golden from the west. Jasper stood in the yard with Thomas talking at his knee and Clara now attached to his other hand, and he looked at Maria over their children's heads with the expression she knew better than any other thing she knew. The particular specific look that was only hers, that asked nothing and said everything. That was the expression of a man who had spent 2 years learning the difference between what could be saved and what could not, and who knew now. With the certainty of someone who had walked 41 miles through 3 counties to prove it, which category she fell into. She smiled at him. He smiled back. The sun went down over the Kansas plains, and the Trask homestead settled into its evening routines, and the apple trees on the eastern slope stood in the last of the light, and Maria Belle Trask stood in her yard in the August evening and thought. As she had thought on the first morning, she opened her eyes in the doctor's office in Abilene and found him still there. That some things were simply true in the way that the land was true and the sky was true, and the particular quality of a man's love was true when it had been tested and had not broken. She had never forgotten what he did. She was never going to forget it. It was not something that needed to be said every day, though they had said it on the important days, on anniversaries, on the birthdays of their children, in the quiet evenings when the lamp was low and they were alone, and the accumulated feeling of a life well built together had a warmth to it that needed no embellishment. It simply was. It was the foundation of everything they had together, the 41-mile walk made in the dark by a man who had already lost one person in the dark and was not willing to lose another. And from that foundation, they had built a life so full and solid and worth having that it still surprised Maria Belle Trask, on ordinary mornings, to find herself in the middle of it. She went inside to put supper on. Jasper came in behind her with Thomas on his shoulders and Clara at his side, and the cabin was full of voices and lamplight and the smell of food. And outside the Kansas evening deepened into night, and the stars came out one at a time, and then all at once, the way they did out on the plains where there was nothing to diminish them, filling the sky from horizon to horizon with a fullness that was, if you were in the habit of reading such things, very much like being carried across 3 counties in the dark by someone who was not going to stop. She was. She was in the habit of reading such things. She had learned it from a mountain man who had put her down in a doctor's office in Abilene and stayed.